people of the United States. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Hello and welcome to George Washington Slept Here, the civic education podcast from Freedom's Foundation at Valley Forge, where we explore American history, civics, and the idea of liberty through conversations with some of our favorite thinkers, writers, and leaders. I'm Jason Rea, Chief Operating Officer at Freedom's Foundation and host of George Washington Slept Here. The format is simple, a long-form conversation with a friend of Freedom's Foundation where everyone can learn something new. Before we go any further, a little housekeeping. We encourage everyone to subscribe to George Washington Slept Here wherever you listen to podcasts, and make sure you get every new episode as soon as it is out. We love hearing from listeners, so please email us at gwshpodcast@gmail.com with your comments, questions, or suggestions, and hit us up at Freedom's Foundation social media at FFVF on Twitter and on Facebook and Instagram at Freedom's Foundation. Today's interview is historian and Andrew Jackson expert Daniel Feller. Hello, Dan.
Hello.
Our conversation today is going to be structured in a way to keep us on track. We want to explore your origin story. How did you become the person sitting before us? And your current work, which includes the Jackson Papers and Andrew Jackson and all things Andrew Jackson. Then I want to talk to you about the state of America today a little bit. And then finally, we end with a quiz. So tell us, where were you born and raised?
I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland, which is a Washington suburb. Lived there until I was 17. Right before my senior year of high school, my family moved to Berkeley, California.
Ooh, so that's a big move. Was that work-related or?
It was work-related for my father.
Okay.
He had been a, dare I say it, Washington lawyer. And then he became a law professor at UC Berkeley.
Oh, excellent.
So we moved right in, this was in, show you how old I am, 1967.
Oh, that's going to be a big year at Berkeley.
That was going to be a big year at Berkeley.
And so you spend your senior year in California.
Spent my senior year in California, went to a small college called Reed College in Portland, Oregon. After a year of doing various things, I decided I wanted to go to grad school in history and wound up at University of Wisconsin.
Okay. And and I'm always curious because Wisconsin certainly has a great education program. Did you always have an idea that education and was it just history or did you want to teach history?
I just wanted to keep reading history,
okay.
Really. I had been reading history since I was a kid. I went into grad school with the idea that I just wanted to learn more history.
Okay.
Without any idea really of what I would do with it. You know, when you go to grad school, especially at Wisconsin, your career, in fact, lays out before you whether or not you knew it would. You know, so from there, the progression into being a college professor was kind of natural, but that's not why I went into it. I just wanted to read more history. My first love, in fact, was medieval history.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I wasn't admitted into the medieval history program. By that time, I realized that to do medieval history, you have to be really good at languages. And I am really bad at languages.
Right. You need to have Latin and French and
yep.
Absolutely. So when did the turn to Andrew Jackson and the sort of pre-Civil War American history?
That's pure serendipity, as I think it is for a lot of historians, actually. I thought I was going to be a social historian to the extent that I thought I was going to be a historian at all when I went to grad school. And I kind of gravitated over toward political history and really until I did my dissertation, I had no particular idea about a period or a subject. I just went, as many grad students do, rooting around looking for something, found an issue that interested me, which was the public land issue in the Jacksonian period. And I was kind of puttering around in primary sources, and I read, you familiar with the Webster-Hain debate?
I'm not. So
this is the debate in the United States Senate in 1830. that ended with Daniel Webster saying liberty and union now and forever, one and inseparable. So I was just kind of reading various well-known primary sources, looking for something to do a dissertation on. And I read the Webster-Hain debate, which is famous because it's a debate about nullification and the nature of the union. But it starts out, and it actually went for a number of days with more people involved, it starts out talking about public land policy. And what they were saying didn't make any sense to me because I hadn't encountered the issue before. And I thought, what is this about? And went looking for the standard monograph on public land policy, which was written in the 1920s and was not fully satisfactory as an explanation. And at some point along the way, I thought, hey, wait a minute. I just found a dissertation topic. That led me into that issue in the Jacksonian period, and it kind of developed from there.
So I'm curious, grad school, you're studying history, you come across this debate in this 1920s monograph, and you realize that there needs to be more, that you might have something that, to say that because this is a unsatisfactory 40 plus almost 50 years later, which makes a lot of sense. Was there anyone particular who was an influence as far as professors or who, were sort of guiding that, led you down this path, or was it really sort of, as you're reading, you discovered it?
It's a good question because there is the old model, where you sit in a seminar with a professor and he, usually a he, says, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And no, I didn't have any of that. I don't want to flatter myself too much, but I was pretty independent as a grad student. My advisor, this is not to say he did not influence me. He did greatly, but not in this way.
Right.
Was a professor named Paul Konkin, who was a great historian and a great intellect. And he was my advisor. I had taken his seminar my first year in 20th century America, which was one of only about 25 topics of which he was master. But I just wanted him as my advisor because I admired his intellect. And so I remember I bopped into his office one day and I said, I found a dissertation topic. He said, good. And that was that.
Excellent. So he was willing to, let you take the lead on this, and that's not always the case.
That's correct. He was willing to let me take the lead and not to leave out another formative influence. Paul left Wisconsin right when I was in the middle of my dissertation to take a position at Vanderbilt.
Okay.
He was an East Tennessee boy, and Vanderbilt wasn't necessarily a move up from Wisconsin, but this was kind of coming home in a grand manner. There was another professor down the hall whose seminar I had taken, who I was familiar with, Richard Sewell, who wrote what is still the standard history of anti-slavery politics. And so when Professor Konkin, I've just called him Paul, Professor Konkin said, I'm leaving. Actually, he didn't tell me. I heard it from somebody else. When I learned he was leaving, I went down to the hall to Professor Sewell, and I said, can I be your advisee? And he said, sure. And Sewell, unlike with Paul Konkin, Paul had dissertation advisees kind of scattered around in various subjects because he himself worked on everything from the history of communitarianism to philosophy of history to still the best one-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson, to standard work on the New Deal and works on the Puritans and on the pragmatist philosophy, you name it. Dick Sewell was a 19th century man.
Okay.
And Dick produced a very, dare I say, illustrious group of grad students, all of whom worked in one or another aspect of 19th century. So in that sense, he had been, in a way, my logical advisor from the beginning.
Sure. So you write this dissertation and you achieve your PhD and you're looking for a job. Where do you end up before you wind up at Tennessee?
1980 was not a good year to be on the job market.
No, it wasn't.
It wasn't, though it's only gotten worse since then, I'm sorry to say. There's a small school in northern Wisconsin, Ashland, Wisconsin, right on Lake Superior, called Northland College. And there was an opening there. This is the way things often used to work and don't work anymore. The graduate advisor, the graduate placement officer at Wisconsin was familiar with the fact that there was an opening at Northland. He suggested I apply for it. I applied for it. Wasn't, I was told, the first choice, but the first choice went elsewhere.
Wow.
Oh, that happens.
Sure.
And so this was an instructorship. I was filling in for a professor who had gotten a 2-year research grant, which was unusual at Northland College, and was off writing a book.
Okay.
So I went up as a visiting instructor at Northland. And then Chuck Twining, that was his name, got another 2-year grant. He was, I'm talking too much, he was a forest historian, and he was writing biographies of Weyerhaeuser executives, for which the Weyerhaeuser company was paying him.
Okay.
So Chuck got another 2-year leave, and so I wound up. I'm sorry. The original point was for 2 years. Then he got a 2-year. I got a 2-year extension. At this point, they started calling me a visiting assistant professor instead of visiting instructor. And then at the end of the 3rd year of that 4-year gig, by that time I was ready to leave. Though, let me put in a word here for small colleges like Northland College.
Sure.
This was the very opposite of the environment of grad school. Nobody cared anything about public land policy in the Jacksonian era. I was the American historian.
Right. This was, and those small schools tend to be about teaching.
Yes.
Yes.
And I taught the entire American history curriculum. Mm-hmm. I ran a film series. I ran a poetry and history series. I was on the college planning committee. It was all these things that you would never get to do.
If you were at a big research institution.
At a big research institute. You wouldn't even get to do as a junior faculty member, and I was a temporary fill-in. So that was a wonderful experience. But at the end of 3 years, I was beginning to feel a little bit remote.
Mm-hmm. And maybe like you, there were bigger things for you to accomplish.
Perhaps. So at that time, the Papers of Andrew Jackson project, which we'll probably talk some more about,
Yep, a little bit,
was hiring an assistant editor. And the project then was located in Nashville on the grounds of the Hermitage, Jackson's plantation home.
Sure.
And so I went there, and that kind of solidified my specialty in the Jacksonian period. And I worked there as a documentary editor for 3 years. Was still looking at this point for a regular teaching job. And at the end of 3 years there, I got hired as an assistant professor at University of New Mexico.
Ah, okay.
Spent the next 17 years there. And then to wrap up the story, in 2003, the man who had been my boss, Harold Moser, as editor of the Jackson Papers, was retiring. The project had moved back to this locale that had always sponsored it, and that was University of Tennessee at Knoxville. So it was now back in Knoxville. And they were looking for somebody to be both a professor of history and editor and director of the Jackson Papers.
Which makes it so that brings those two sort of strands of your work together in a single place.
Yes, and I don't want to be immodest and say that the position was written for me, but it might as well have been. And there were a number of some of them my friends, very well qualified historians who applied for it, but none of them had also spent 3 years on the project earlier and knew it inside out, which I did.
Right. So tell us, what is the Andrew Jackson Papers, and what was the purpose of the project? Because obviously this has been going on for 20 years before you even came on board as editor. So what are they trying to accomplish, and what's the I think I know, but I don't want to assume anything.
Well, first let me say it's a publishing project, not an archive.
Okay.
Many people say, "Oh, you have Jackson's papers there." No, we don't. Jackson's original manuscript papers are in various places.
So they're scattered.
They're scattered. The largest single collection is in the Library of Congress in Washington.
Which makes sense.
But there are also lots of other places. The Papers of Andrew Jackson is a project to gather, and that means gather images or copies, not the originals. Gather, order, and then publish all of Andrew Jackson's extant literary record.
So everything.
Everything.
If he wrote it, your goal is to...
Everything that was that he wrote, that was written to him, that was written for him, like drafts of his presidential messages, and put it all together. Again, put it in order, which is a very complicated process, much more than you'd think, because we're talking about hundreds of thousands of pieces of paper, and they got mixed up. And, some of them are letters without signatures. Some of them are letters without dates. Some of them are commingled with other papers. And it's not like doing one jigsaw puzzle. It's like doing 10 jigsaw puzzles that the pieces have all been dumped together, and you don't have the picture on the box to tell you which piece belongs where.
Let me just ask you, this is everything, not just his presidential papers, but this is personal correspondence.
Everything.
This is professional from his days in the Army. This is, you're trying to put your hands on everything.
Yep.
And then publish it chronologically, or
publish it chronologically.
Okay.
Yes. This is one of a number of similar projects, and there's a kind of genealogy of them. It began with the papers of Thomas Jefferson.
Right, which are over at Princeton. Or at least that project is.
That project is at Princeton, yes. And that project got started back around 1950. And the idea was that they were going to do this for Thomas Jefferson, and they were going to do it in a few years.
And I know for a fact they're still working on it.
Not only are they still working on it, but it's been divided into two projects. They started out with a chronological series, and then they set up another project, which is actually at Charlottesville, to do the retirement years.
Okay.
So they jump ahead to 1809 and go forward from there.
Okay.
But the Jefferson papers started, and it was a great idea. This is, of course, long before the internet. And if you wanted at that time to canvass, to what Jefferson had written and what was written to him, you had to get in your car and drive all around the country looking for stuff. So to put this all together in a series of volumes was a marvelous innovation. And partly spearheaded by the editor of the Jefferson papers, a federal agency was created, the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, NHPRC, which is still around. And then a number of other projects sprang up, mostly Founding Fathers projects, including the papers of George Washington.
Sure.
And there was a Hamilton project and a Franklin project. And then around 1970, partly under the orchestration of the NHPRC, they branched out into the next generation. And so there was a Daniel Webster project, a Henry Clay project, and a Jackson Papers project. And so the project got started around 1970. And it took about 10 years to just collect the stuff. Mm-hmm. Because if you're going to do it chronologically, you have to get all of it, or what you think is all of it.
Right.
Before you start. And to carry that line of story further along, back in the 1970s, a historian named Jesse Leamish issued a blast against what he called the papers of great white men. Pointing out that in doing all these projects and federally funding them, the historical profession was devoting a lot of energy to making a certain part of the American record available to the public. The guys who were on your currency.
Sure.
And so since then, partly I think inspired by that Leamish blast, which was famous at the time, projects have sprung up to do famous women, famous non-white men, and then to do whole subjects rather than just people.
Right.
So there's, for instance, a very well-reputed documentary history of emancipation.
Sure, that makes sense. Yeah.
Relying very heavily on the records of the Freedmen's Bureau in Washington.
Okay.
And then, of course, the internet and online publication has changed everything.
The ability to digitize those records.
Yeah.
I can imagine changes. Maybe in some cases, the at least in some people's minds, the necessity of some of that, because now if there's a digitized version on a website somewhere, at least it's searchable and a researcher can find it as they're working on their PhD or their book.
Yes.
But I imagine there's something to maybe it splits generationally. The old guys like us who are like having a volume that you can take off a shelf and open as opposed to a digital version. But I wanna get you, and maybe we'll just pause there and to talk for everybody listening. Give us your best thumbnail sketch of Andrew Jackson and what we ought to know about him that this project is built around.
Oh dear.
And he's a massive influence, but just give us the what we have to know.
That may be two questions. What the project is built around is the presumption that Andrew Jackson is important.
Right.
And no more than that. That is...
Not that he's singularly, not that he's the most important, but that here's an important figure from American history for various and sundry reasons.
Various and sundry is the key thing.
Right.
And I would be tempted to leave it at that rather than make any judgment about whether he was worthy to be admired or condemned.
Well, and that's the key debate, right? Because this is the hero of New Orleans. And if you go to New Orleans, there he is in the center of Jackson Square on horse. He's the hero because the last battle of the War of 1812, he is there defending New Orleans. And so, there is this heroic, and then he's a slaveholder, which for some people today, that's a black mark that covers, and then there's Indian removal, which is sort of the 900-pound gorilla whenever you talk about Jackson. And so he's complicated. He may be in some ways the very definition of why American history is hard, is because it's not black and white, and there are no simple heroes and there are no simple villains, because we're talking about human beings.
That's a better answer than I could give. Thank you. You just let me off the hook. Actually, I think that's exactly correct. There's two issues here. One of them is what the project does.
Right. And
the other one is the view of Jackson. One thing about being a documentary editor is that you have to be, if you're going to be good at it, you need to suppress a great deal of this. Your job is to put the facts before the public.
You're not making a judgment.
You're not making a judgment. One kind of occupational hazard for documentary editors, and there are some very famous cases of this, are editors who fall in love with their subjects and self-identify with them to an extent that it actually distorts their scholarship. It doesn't help if you are editing the papers of John C. Calhoun that you've decided that John C. Calhoun was the greatest man who ever lived and he was right about everything.
Right.
And his enemies were wrong about anything. And that's only one of many examples I could name. So as a matter of simply doing our job, we at the Jackson Papers are deliberately agnostic on the question of whether he was a good or bad president or an admirable or a despicable guy. I will say, coming back to the question of his importance, that Jackson has he's important actually for what he did, but also for what he symbolized. But that's not a static character. Jackson has always been taken as tremendously symbolic of America in all sorts of different ways. And it's always involved controversy. And the subjects of the controversy can change quite a bit. But Jackson, it seems, is always at the center of it. You mentioned, if you mention Andrew Jackson today, if you play, word association with people, what do you know about Andrew Jackson? Well, he killed all the Indians.
Right.
Well, it's not quite that simple, but that's what people think they know about him.
Right.
Certainly, Indian removal is the thing that we associate with Jackson today. As I love to point out, there's a book, I'm sure you're familiar with it, Arthur Schlesinger's The Age of Jackson.
Well, I was just going to say, this is the only man who in American history has a period, an era
named after
him, which by definition, at least to me as a non-historian, says, oh, we need to pay attention for no other reason than why is it at some point a group of historians said, yes, he is so emblematic of this period that we're simply going to call it the Age of Jackson.
The Age of Jackson. And Schlesinger's book, which has 520-something pages of text. And it's a magnificent book, but by the way, almost nothing in it has gone unchallenged. But it's still being challenged. This is a book that was published in 1945. And I still assigned it to graduate students. And there are not many things that are published in 1945 that you can read without just cringing now. It's a book that's staggering in its scope and its erudition, presents a decided view of Jackson, which many disagree with, but the point is that it is still the basis for that disagreement. You know how much is in it on Indian removal?
I imagine it's very little.
2 sentences.
2 sentences.
And those 2 sentences are in a chapter on Andrew Jackson and religion.
Oh.
Or actually on Jacksonian democracy and religion.
Well, that's interesting.
They're buried in a paragraph.
Right.
Now, the startling thing, I'm taking a historical perspective on historians here.
Right.
Is that you read Schlesinger today and you say, where are the idiots? That's not what most Americans said when that book came out.
Right.
And won a Pulitzer Prize. It was challenged on other grounds, challenged on the grounds that his view of the bank controversy was slanted.
So tell us, just tell us in 2 sentences, for those who don't know, what happens with the banks under Jackson?
In 2 sentences.
Or 3.
The thing that passed for a central bank in the United States, in the early United States, was something called the Bank of the United States, which was a part public, part private corporation incorporated by Congress. Which was incorporated by Congress in order to do many of the things that the Federal Reserve now does and many of the things that the Treasury Department now does, like print money. And there had always been questions about its constitutionality. There had always been questions about whether the country really needed one or not. There was an original first bank. I've already gone beyond 3 sentences.
Let's keep going.
An original first bank that was created by the Federalists and then allowed to die by the Jeffersonians. And then after the War of 1812, they created a new one, the Second Bank of the United States, chartered in 1816 to run for 20 years. In 1832, with its recharter, or with the expiration of its charter on the horizon, Congress passed a bill to recharter it. Jackson vetoed it. And that veto message is the signature document of his presidency.
And interestingly, if I recall, still holds some of that language in that veto is still current today. There are those whose criticism of the moneyed classes and even of capitalism are maybe unintentionally quoting Jackson. And I don't have the quote sitting here in front of me, but
Elizabeth Warren.
Okay, yes.
Among others, yes. And this was why Jackson was a hero to the Democratic Party up through about 3/4 of the 20th century,
Right.
is that he was the man who had stood up against the big banks.
Right, and he pulls the federal funds out of the bank, and
Yes.
it ends up being chartered as a Pennsylvania
Banjo.
bank, and then the state banks, and there is it's a really great look at what happens as a result of it. There are those who say, is it the 1837?
The Panic of
the panic
1837
is really the fault of Jackson and this controversy with the banks. But again, that's for probably at this point for academic debate more than anything.
Yeah. In the bank veto, Jackson said, now first I should say, he said a whole bunch of things.
Sure.
I mean, he threw every argument that he could against the bank. He claimed that it was of doubtful constitutionality, which is an argument that had been around before. He claimed that it could become an agent of a foreign power. There's an interesting backstory behind that argument. He claimed that it was inexpedient. He claimed this. He claimed that. But the passage that lingered was one where he said, "It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes." Mm-hmm. And this argument, now I will be a little bit partisan here and say that Jackson's attack on the bank has often been criticized as ignorant and stupid and know nothing. In this particular argument, he was, I think, if you broaden it out a little bit, saying there's something wrong when bankers run the country to suit their interests and not yours.
Right. And what's interesting is it's an argument. It's not a new argument. It's Jefferson's argument against Hamilton. It is going back to the beginning of the country, and when Hamilton floats the idea of purchasing debt and making all of the debt of the states federal debt. And the argument is, well, that means that we're going to be doing the bidding of the wealthy. Mm-hmm. But what he saw was there's this other piece of it. So, yep. But it becomes this defining action that Jackson takes in vetoing the bank and sending, and even though there's, I think, 2 years or so left on the old charter, he pulls the federal funds out, puts it in a number of different state banks, which brings up a whole nother level of issue. But it's not until the Civil War itself that the federal government really looks at banking again, because they need to finance the war.
Mm-hmm. So, to skip ahead a little bit from that, again, Jackson's battle against the plutocrats, against the malefactors of great wealth, these are later phrases, is what made Jackson important to, at least to those in his own party, in the Democratic Party, up through the late 20th century. So to circle back, this is why Schlesinger could write a book called The Age of Jackson, which is centered around the bank war, not even mention or barely mention Indian removal in passing.
Right.
And most of his readership didn't see anything missing.
Right.
And that tells us something that we could talk quite a bit about the dangers of presentism, but more about how certain things always seem like they must have always been the way they are today.
Right.
And studying Jackson, you realize that's not true. I'm not by no means saying that Indian removal didn't deserve the prominence that it has. And in fact, I've pointed out myself, when Jackson came to Washington as president, he really had no idea what he was going to do on a lot of things.
Right.
His banking policy didn't develop for several years. The one thing he knew he wanted to do from the very beginning was remove the Indians. That was literally, chronologically, the first thing on his agenda. So let's talk about Indian removal. If that's the thing he comes to Washington with a mind to do, and everything else is in some ways ancillary, and he'll figure it out as he goes, why was that his number one issue coming into the presidency? That's an excellent question. That's professor speak for let me think a minute.
Sure. Interview speak too.
Interview speak for, well, I think it was partly from his own background.
Because he's on the frontier, which at the time,
Yep.
he is the frontier. And so there would have been, or let me ask, were there in his younger days clashes with Native Americans?
Yes, though, let me moderate that a little bit. The major clashes were when he was a general. During and after the War of 1812.
Right.
So he had pronounced views on Indian removal, fully developed views on Indian removal.
And he's part of the Seminole Wars as well in Florida.
He is the Seminole War. Yeah,
right.
Yeah. The reason why I hesitated a minute there is that we have this image, or at least some people do, of Andrew Jackson kind of hating Indians viscerally from his days as a frontier youth.
Mm-hmm. And it's really later.
It's really later. The people Jackson grew up hating and fighting were not Indians. They were British.
Yes, of course.
And if you look at Jackson's authorized biography, the hatred of the British starts in the first paragraph.
Wow.
This is biography written of Jackson with his approval and with his help. First edition was published in 1817 by two of his staff officers. And it talks about how Jackson grew up on the tales of British tyranny and oppression that his Irish-born mother told him.
Ah, there we go.
And as late as the War of 1812, Jackson, in messages to his troops and elsewhere, portrayed the Indians as dupes and puppets of the British. It's Britain that's the enemy of civilization, the enemy of humanity, the barbaric, tyrannic, go on. The rhetoric here is quite overheated.
Right, right.
But later on, during and after the war, Jackson became a famous Indian fighter. He convinced himself for reasons that he had reasons, which is not to say they were not self-serving, because they were, for believing that Indians and whites could not coexist, and therefore the Indians had to move. It was kind of a standard argument, which it is easy to see the holes in it.
Sure.
Frankly, the racism in it.
Right. But it takes a very long time, and it takes, because as you say, Schlesinger's got two sentences in 1945, did you say? And so it speaks to this idea that, this is why history and historians revisit topics, because the angle of our gaze changes. Something that wasn't important becomes important for a new era. And certainly there has been a great deal of that in professional history over the last several decades, is the shift to telling a different set of stories.
A different set of stories. And we hope a better set of stories.
Right. Right.
And one has to realize that, and at the same time, I think, recognize that people who told different stories in the past were, and here I'm talking about Schlesinger,
right.
And I could also talk about people like Edmund Morgan, Kenneth Stamp. We're not telling different stories or telling stories differently because they were bad people, but because they, like we, were creatures of their own time.
Right. And the one of the gifts of time is this distance from an incident that allows it to be examined differently.
Mm-hmm.
And so is 21st century important from the viewpoint of history? Certainly was not 75 years ago. And I think that's important. But I also think what's important, and you've talked about this in academic forums, where is how do we do this in a way that allows us to engage in an important conversation, but isn't steeped in politics, isn't steeped in appraisal or judgment, but is simply a way to talk about the important things that need to be talked about. And there's not really a question in there. So let me get to a question.
Statement which I wish I had made myself.
But as a professional historian, you were at a conference in COVID amongst your peers, and it was specifically about this comparison at the time, and I think this was 2020, the comparison of President Donald Trump and President Andrew Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
And you gave a paper talking about what does that mean, but and what you thought was a pretty tame look at that situation and how contemporary historians bring their own politics to these kinds of things. It blew up completely. So I want to hear about that, because that to me gets to the core of one of the things this podcast is really concerned about, and Freedom's Foundation is really concerned about, which is how do we engage with one another over difficult topics without the incivility that you experienced in this situation, but that people experience. How can we be rational and listen to one another and be respectful, respect being one of the key components of civic responsibility from our point of view. And that's really hard in some cases, particularly when we start bringing in contemporary politics.
Well, that was about 10 questions.
Yes. So you got from none to 10. So
well,
pick any of them.
Well, let me start out, because your listeners won't necessarily be familiar with this.
Yes.
With the paper itself, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but the origins of this particular paper that I delivered, all of a sudden, Andrew Jackson was all over the news after candidate Trump and then President Trump embraced Andrew Jackson as his model. And on the one hand, Donald Trump and his acolytes were singing the praises of what they thought was the historical Andrew Jackson. On the other hand, his critics were condemning Jackson for, and I had a phrase that I think I used in the paper. Donald Trump said, "I am just like Andrew Jackson. I'm the hero of the common people, hated by the elites, loved by the masses." And Trump's critics said, "Yeah, you are just like Andrew Jackson. You're a bigot. You're a racist. You're an ignoramus. You're a tyrant." So that's kind of the way it was framed. As a historian, I was merely a bystander, I thought, to this debate, except that the debate quickly escalated to the point where people on both sides were saying things that were just flatly wrong about Jackson.
And that's where your alarms went off.
That's where my alarms went off.
The politics didn't matter.
I did not then, and I do not want now to take a position on contemporary politics. I mean, I have my views on contemporary politics, but they're separate.
And those, like you, those are not the concern of this show.
Those are not the concern.
What is the concern is this, this controversy about, for you, history, and for us, how do we talk to one another about this?
And what, frankly, I was not astonished to see some of the pro-Trump people saying some things about Andrew Jackson that weren't true. These were not historians generally. I was surprised and dismayed to see people of my own tribe, usually on the other side, almost always on the other side, not to see that they were criticizing Donald Trump. Again, as a historian, that's not my concern, but that they were saying things about Jackson that were just wrong.
And they should have known.
And they should have known. They should have, and I said that. I said, you should have known better. Mm-hmm. One of the things I said in the paper was, just because you despise Andrew Jackson, even if on good grounds, does not entitle you to accuse him of things he didn't do.
Fair enough.
I thought that was fair enough. So we had historians, by the way, many of whom I knew, saying things that I just thought were nuts, and things. There's a whole area where we can, as historians, disagree. Often it comes down to subtleties of language.
Right.
Was Andrew Jackson responsible, as you mentioned, for the Panic of 1837? Okay, that's a whole long debate.
Right.
But it's a debate that can be held. But when you say, as a Pulitzer Prize winning historian said, that Andrew Jackson kept the skulls of Indians he had killed around the Hermitage as trophies to show off to guests. Or when you say, as in fact that same historian said, that the Indian Removal Act, the law passed in 1830, mandated the army to go in and seize Indian lands. I mean, these are factual things that can be checked in 5 minutes by anybody who knows what they're doing.
Right.
And so my paper, which was aimed largely, at my own tribe, dare I say, was an admonishment to not to withhold our perspective as historians, but to do as historians what we as historians particularly know how to do, which is keep it grounded in actual facts.
Right. And so there's a lot going on there, and I wonder, I think there is this question for the historians, which is how do you engage? And I think your advice is, as all people have a right to engage in contemporary politics, we just make sure that what we are saying is factual. And but I wonder, is there some other advice that we can give that says, how do we not get caught up in the passion of politics and leave behind the reason of a pursuit like history? That seems to be where the breakdown, that the passion of politics sort of overwhelms everything.
I'm not sure that was a question.
I'm not sure it is either, but I'm curious what you have to say.
But I will agree entirely with it.
Yeah.
There is this potential, at least, overlap or bleed through between the discourse of politics and the discourse of academia. And mostly I would say that the discourse of politics could learn a lot from the discourse of academia. What it could learn is precisely the civility of which you're speaking. It can learn how to be critical and to disagree. And lest I portray myself as Pollyanna here, I can be pretty critical.
Sure.
When I read a book that I think is deeply flawed and I write a review, I think it's my job to say that. But it's also my job to explain why.
Sure. And I'm guessing it is not.
It
isn't based in, I don't like this historian. It's based in that this historian said these things, and here's my disagreement with these things that were said.
And you can go at each other on an intellectual plane, and that's what academics are very good at. And I think if I'm probably living in a dream world, if people who engaged in political discourse, followed that admonition, we would all be much better off. The bleed through, unfortunately, I would say, and this was part of the problem that explains the reaction to my paper, was that it now goes the other way, that historians are adopting the rhetorical devices that we're used to in politics, being careless in language, being careless with facts, and being personal.
Right.
Let me give an anecdote here, which just comes to mind. There was a historian you may be familiar with named Charles Sellers.
I'm not, so please.
He was a great mid-20th century historian.
Okay.
He wrote a book called The Market Revolution in around 1990, which was supposed to be a grand synthesis of the Jacksonian era.
Okay.
And before that, he had written 2 volumes, though he never finished it. He written the first 2 volumes of a biography of James K. Polk.
Ah, interesting.
He was a leading Jacksonian period historian. The Market Revolution advanced a thesis. It was a synthesis built around a thesis. And it was rather severely criticized by, among others, Daniel Walker Howe, who wrote
What Hath God Wrought?
What Hath God Wrought? And interestingly, Charlie Sellers' Market Revolution was supposed to originally be the volume in the Oxford History of the United States that became What Hath God Wrought.
Okay.
That Market Revolution was supposed to be in that series. It instead was published outside the series by Oxford. And then Dan Howe wrote What Hath God Wrought. Another distinguished historian, a British historian named Richard Cowardine, was a leading Lincoln expert, but also an expert on the subject of religion and politics in the Jacksonian era. And they had some severe criticisms of Sellers' work. Both his defense and their criticisms were packaged together in a book called The Market Revolution in America, as an edited collection. And the criticisms are pretty pointed. None of it was personal. The people involved had the highest respect for each other. They still do. Charles Sellers died recently, and everyone lamented that.
Yeah.
I knew Sellers less well than some others, but I had written a piece called The Market Revolution Ate My Homework, which may convey something of what I thought of the thesis. It didn't matter, you know. We were all in pursuit of a truer history, and we all thought of ourselves as, you know, as colleagues and fellows, and therefore friends.
Well,
in that pursuit.
And you said the key word, which was respect. That the criticism was grounded in respect for one's person being criticized. And again, it's laying out that argument. It's marshaling the facts, but all of that doesn't matter if respect is not there. And that seems to be, and once upon a time, we talk about it all the time, that there was a different relationship in partisan politics, that there was respect. And Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill often come to mind, as they would during the day come to blows over policy, but they could sit and have a drink. But I want to close this out because we're getting close to time, because we've been talking about the politics and what it has done to us today and in the last, we'll say, decades, just to not blame anyone particularly. But Andrew Jackson was part of a couple of elections, and a couple of them were sort of knocked down, drag out. Him and John Quincy Adams in 24, and then again in 28, and then in 32, it's Jackson and Henry Clay. Those three elections are, I think we would look at them, and I think many people today would be surprised at how harsh they were. And maybe I wonder, is there a parallel to politics and presidential elections today? And do you think there are any lessons that we might take from what happened then to apply to today?
Oh, I would shudder to take lessons.
Or maybe they're the anti-lessons of what not to do.
I think I am going to pass on delivering lessons.
Fair enough.
So as not to put myself in a false position. I think looking at those elections, one can see, and actually you can see this in 1800 also.
Right.
American politics has always had a cutthroat side. It's always had a see-me underside to it. Whether that see-me underside was more, whether the nastiness, the vulgarity, the slander, was more prominent then than now, I'm not sure myself.
Right. Is it a question of amplification today in a way that it wasn't then? But
one thing I'll say is that I think historians have actually over-amplified because this resonates more with us today. One aspect of, in particular, the 1828 campaign, I've seen it's frequently described as like the dirtiest campaign in American history.
Right.
And I'd say, no, it wasn't. Not even before recent campaigns was it the dirtiest campaign in American history. But historians have fixated remarkably on one particular aspect of Jackson's persona at the time, and that was his marriage to Rachel. And this is the story that everybody knows. He was attacked for his marriage to Rachel, and she didn't hear about it till finally she did by accident, and it broke her heart, and she died. Well, my reading of things, and I think I've studied this election pretty carefully, the attack on Jackson for being a bigamist or a wife stealer was actually a very minor part of the criticism of Jackson's character. I mean, it was there. There were a whole lot of things there, just as there are a whole lot of things there in any modern campaign. The real criticism of Jackson, the more central criticism of Jackson, was that he was a dangerous man.
Right.
That he was, the word psychotic hadn't been invented yet, but that he was bloodthirsty, openly contemptuous of behavioral norms, openly contemptuous of the limits of the United States Constitution, that he would become an American Caesar. And while my work at the Jackson Papers has convinced me that Jackson was not, whether you like him or not, that the worst of the accusations against Jackson turned out to be, let's say, unfounded. They weren't unfounded based on his previous career. The things that really got people's attention in 1828, more than his marriage to Rachel, were his defiance of orders, his willingness to shoot his own soldiers under what many people thought were egregious circumstances, his willingness to capture and shoot British civilians, his willingness to challenge everybody, and he saw practically to duels. Even though he only fought one duel, he issued a whole lot of challenges. And people thought he was a dangerous man.
Yeah.
And based upon what you saw of him in public in 1828, there was very, very good reason to think he was a dangerous man.
Right. Thank you. We always end with a quiz. It's an easy quiz. It's really just an opportunity to learn a little bit more about you. Okay. What's one thing you would want every American to learn more about?
The causes of the Civil War.
Okay.
Or I would say the cause of the Civil War. There's only one.
There's only one. If you had not chosen a career in academia, what might you have become?
Tour guide at a historic site.
There you go.
I did it several times during summers as a grad student.
Okay.
I thought it was a lot of fun. I thought it was the best training in the world.
Yep. And that's now, what's interesting is that's now become public history and something that, is pursued academically. And there's some really wonderful people who take that not just as a part-time summer gig, but as a real calling.
I thought of it.
Yeah. Yeah. What's one thing about you that would surprise most people? And I have one if you
I'm really a nice guy.
Well, that's not hard to believe, but I'll throw one to you. The Knoxville Area Transit Most Valuable Passenger
You
Award
read my
winner.
Veto.
I did.
I was so proud of that.
I'll tell you a quick story.
By the way, I'm the one and only
the
winner.
one and only winner of that award.
Yes.
I was at a day-long conference back when I was teaching. Up in Boston at the Kennedy Library, and when I left and hopped on the red line to head home, who was in my car but Governor Dukakis, who had been one of the speakers at this conference. He was a truly dedicated, and I believe to this day still is, a dedicated MBTA rider. And he took public transit everywhere. And here's this, retired governor, former presidential candidate, and he's just sitting there, chatting away with people. And we talked a little bit about the conference, and then, we parted ways. And I loved living in a city where that was. I lived 5 years without a car and just took the bus and the train everywhere. If you could meet just one historical person, who would it be?
Well, it would have to be Abe Lincoln.
Okay. Even more than Andrew Jackson.
I'm not sure I'd want to meet Andrew Jackson.
And final question, and we ask this question of everybody.
I will say that if I have a fondness for any politician of the Jacksonian era, and that's a big if, it would be Henry Clay.
Yeah. Yeah, I find him fascinating, really and truly. Okay, last question. Bourbon or scotch?
English beer.
Okay. There it is. Well, thanks to our guest, Daniel Feller. I can't wait to have you back and talk more. I also want to thank our producers, Laura Kennedy and Sarah Rasmussen. A special shout out to friend of the pod, Bill Franz, for his art design. Special thanks to longtime Freedoms Foundation historic interpreter Bob Gleason for his contributions to the intro. And most of all, I want to thank you, our listeners. Please subscribe, follow, rate, and review George Washington Slept Here wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please tell your friends. To learn more about Freedoms Foundation at Valley Forge, check out our website at freedomsfoundation.org and follow us on social media. And finally, our email again, gwshpodcast@gmail.com with questions, comments, suggestions. Daniel Feller, thank you very much.
Thank you.